My stepfather always had that smug look, the kind of look that drips with certainty while the world tilts under his feet. Sitting across from him in the polished leather chairs of Thompson and Associates, I could feel it radiating like heat. He never suspected that today, his entire performance, his act of control, of intimidation, of claiming my mother's love and fortune, was about to collapse. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of old paper, polished oak, and something sterile. Like a promise of truth waiting to be revealed, Richard leaned back. One hand draped lazily across the armrest, the other smoothing the wrinkles in his custom-tailored suit. "You really think your mother would leave anything to you, Kevin?" His voice was casual, but heavy, loaded with venom disguised as a rhetorical question. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I simply watched him. Watched the way he flexed his fingers like a man practicing dominance over the invisible strings of fate. Next to him, his children Jessica and Tyler sat, like miniatures of greed, absorbed in their own worlds. Jessica scrolled through her phone, occasionally letting out small murmurs of disdain, as if the device itself whispered secrets of entitlement. Tyler, barely old enough to drink legally, was already plotting imaginary purchases on his iPad, his eyes lighting up every time he scrolled past a sports car he hoped he'd one day own. "First, I'm getting that Lamborghini," Tyler announced, without preamble. "Then a condo in Miami. I'm thinking Paris next summer, maybe London." His words floated through the office, a toxic mix of youth, arrogance, and privilege. Jessica looked up, smirking. "Oh, definitely Paris. I've always wanted to spend a few months living there. Fashion, cafes, it's perfect." And Richard smiled. That infuriating, self-satisfied grin that had convinced my mother he was a man worth trusting. He caressed the wedding ring still on his finger, the same ring he had slipped onto my mother's hand just months before her terminal diagnosis. I swallowed, the bile rising in my throat. "My name is Kevin, and I've spent 32 years navigating life, love, and loyalty, only to witness a man who never deserved my mother's trust sit there, gloating as if the universe itself had bowed to his ambition." This office, with its mahogany desks and chrome finishes, smelled of greed and false security. I pretended to scroll through my emails, feigning absorbed attention, while he continued his practiced monologue about my supposed neglect. She realized. Richard's voice oozed satisfaction, that you never truly cared. Always too busy with your engineering career, always too selfish to see what she needed in her twilight years. I remembered every detail, every orchestrated omission. The cancelled visits he never told me about. The messages that mysteriously never reached my phone. The doctor appointments that changed without notice. Every accident had been meticulously designed to paint me as the son who abandoned his mother, while he cast himself as her savior. The secretary poked her head in. "Mr. Thompson is ready to see you." Richard rose first, flanked by Jessica and Tyler, and I followed behind like a shadow. Marble floors reflected our procession. The echo of our steps felt heavy, ceremonial. Mr. Thompson sat behind a thick oak desk, a folder open before him. His eyes met mine briefly, and I caught a flicker of something unspoken, a mix of professionalism, amusement, and the hint that he already knew how this day would end. "Please, have a seat," he said, gesturing toward the chairs. His calm voice contrasted sharply with the tension radiating from Richard. Richard, of course, took the center chair like a king claiming a throne. "We've reviewed everything with Margaret," he said, leaning forward, "and it's all quite clear." His children exchanged triumphant glances, ready to inherit a life sculpted from entitlement. I maintained my neutral expression, but inside, my mind raced, calculating, remembering, anticipating. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat and opened the first folder. "Before we proceed with the reading of Margaret Morrison's will, dated 3 years ago, there are a few clarifications needed regarding the estate." Richard leaned in, eyes shining with greed. "Of course, James, Margaret and I discussed her wishes at length. She knew exactly what she wanted. She finally understood who truly cared for her." Jessica snorted quietly. Kevin hardly ever showed up these past few years. Tyler nodded, head buried in his iPad. Always excuses. Work trips, meetings, deadlines. I clenched my fists silently. They conveniently ignored the truth, the carefully laid sabotage, the medical manipulation, the intercepted communications, all orchestrated by the very man claiming to be her devoted husband. Richard continued, his voice dripping with false grief. Kevin was never interested in participating in her care. Never asked questions, never noticed. I remembered the countless times I had arrived at the hospital, only to find he had altered visiting hours, modified medications, and intercepted my calls. Every instance meticulously engineered to isolate my mother and turn her against me. And the estate itself, Mr. Thompson asked, his tone deceptively calm, leaning slightly forward. Richard's chest puffed with pride. Of course, the main residence, the lake house, all investments, everything. Mr. Thompson's eyes shifted to me briefly. And you, Mr. Morrison, were you aware of all of these financial arrangements? Richard laughed, a hollow, triumphal sound. Kevin never cared about finances. Always detached. Always uninterested. That's why she relied on me. I kept my face neutral, but internally catalogued the irony. Detached. Every bank statement I've intercepted, every deposit I made for her care, every piece of evidence I've quietly preserved would prove otherwise. Jessica sighed dramatically. It's so sad. A family that could have been close, but Kevin chose not to be there. Mr. Thompson raised an eyebrow, almost imperceptibly. Something in his expression told me he already knew the script Richard had rehearsed for years, and that it was about to unravel in a spectacular fashion. Richard smoothed his tie, blissfully unaware. Then we can proceed. I don't expect surprises. The lawyer opened the document. Very well. I, Margaret Morrison, being of sound mind and body, declare this to be my last will and testament. Richard shifted impatiently. Get to the important parts. To my dear husband, Richard Morrison, the lawyer continued. The sum of $500,000. Richard froze. Jessica gasped. Tyler's mouth hung open. $500. I asked, neutral as stone. And to my stepchildren, Jessica and Tyler Morrison, I leave $250 each. Mr. Thompson said calmly. Richard's knuckles turned white as he gripped the desk. This is fraud. She was on medication. She wasn't in her right mind. I felt a cold, calculating rage rise, coiling in my chest. 5 years of lies, manipulations, blocked visits, intercepted messages, all leading to this moment. And yet I remained calm, because none of them knew my mother had been far smarter than they ever imagined. Richard's voice rose to a near shout. You manipulated her. You took advantage of her sickness. I met his gaze evenly. And how exactly did I do that, Richard? You exploited her medications, her vulnerability. I smiled faintly, deliberately. Funny, I've kept meticulous records. Every visit, every gift, every phone call she attempted to make. All intercepted by you, all meant to isolate her and paint me as ungrateful. Jessica and Tyler exchanged nervous glances. For the first time, confusion clouded their certainty. By Mr. Thompson leaned back, opening another folder. Kevin, your mother began investigating exactly 2 years ago. Richard's facade faltered. She noticed inconsistencies. I said, my voice calm cold. Messages that never arrived. Gifts that never reached her. Money that never appeared. In her accounts, she started connecting the dots. And you, Richard, never suspected that the son you've tried to vilify would be the one holding the evidence to prove everything. Tyler stammered, Dad, that can't be. Can't be? I asked, voice steady. Let's talk about the evidence, shall we? I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a neatly organized stack of documents. Screenshots, bank statements, photographs, delivery confirmations, everything meticulously compiled. This, I said, laying them on the desk, is everything. Every intercepted message, every redirected deposit, every gift returned to sender because you couldn't resist your little power plays. Richard's breathing grew shallow. Jessica and Tyler were pale. And the best part, I continued, voice low, controlled, is that you documented it all. You documented your own greed, your own lies, your own manipulation. Every dollar spent, every act of isolation, captured in a way that ensures your plans will never succeed. Mr. Thompson's lips curved ever so slightly. That smile, that one I had noticed before, it wasn't just professional amusement, it was the calm satisfaction of someone who knows exactly how this day will end. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but I cut him off, calm, precise. You think you've won, Richard. You think you've hidden everything. But my mother, she knew exactly who you were from the start. And she left instructions, evidence, and strategy for exactly this moment. I leaned back, watching the color drain from their faces. The silence in the office was absolute, heavy, suffocating. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of the vindication I had waited for. Measured and meticulously preserved. Richard froze, his face contorted in disbelief. This isn't possible, he stammered, his voice breaking despite the suit that tried to make him look composed. Jessica's phone slipped from her hand. Tyler's iPad clattered to the floor. They had never seen him like this, vulnerable, exposed, powerless. The smugness, the arrogance, the air of control vanished, and in that silence, I felt the first real wave of satisfaction. Isn't it? I asked softly, leaning forward just enough to let the weight of my words settle. Isn't it remarkable how meticulous Mum was? How she planned, documented, and anticipated everything you might do. Richard's hands shook as he reached for the chair arm. Kevin, you're exaggerating. You're fabricating this. I shook my head slowly. No, Richard, everything is real. Every intercepted message, every diversion, every feigned oversight, she recorded it all, and I've kept it safe. She trusted me with the truth, with justice, and now, with the evidence. Jessica whispered, almost to herself, all this time. She knew. All this time, I repeated, letting the words echo through the office. She knew exactly what you were doing. She saw every unauthorized medication change, every attempt to isolate her from her friends, from me. Every act of deception, documented and preserved. Tyler looked pale, his bravado evaporating like morning mist. Dad, you wouldn't do that to Mum, would you? Richard's face twisted in outrage. I didn't do anything. This is manipulation. You're trying to frame me. I pulled a second folder from my briefcase, thicker than the first. Frame you? No, Richard. This is your own doing. You documented it all for me. And thanks to my mother, it's all here: medical records, photos, witness statements, recordings. Mr. Thompson leaned forward, flipping through the pages deliberately. Kevin, your mother anticipated that Richard might try to dispute the will or undermine her decisions. That's why she instructed me to collect everything meticulously. Every irregularity, every suspicious action, every interaction with her doctors. She left nothing to chance. Richard stood abruptly, knocking over his chair in frustration. You're lying. This is ridiculous. I smiled faintly, letting the calm precision of my words land like a hammer. I wish it were, Richard, but Mum was smarter than you ever imagined. She built her empire, her life, and her plan with foresight, strategy, and patience. Everything you think you control, you never did. Jessica put her hands over her mouth. Tyler sank back into his chair, white as a sheet. Richard's bravado crumbled as I reached into the third folder-sealed envelope labeled in my mother's handwriting. This, I said, holding it carefully, is her final letter, written to me, not to you. She anticipated your moves, your lies, your manipulations. She knew that one day, someone would have to ensure justice. I broke the seal and began reading aloud, my voice steady, even as my hands trembled slightly. To my dear son Kevin, if you are reading this, the trap has worked perfectly. Richard believes he has control, that his manipulation has succeeded. He is wrong. I have documented everything, anticipated every move, and ensured that the truth cannot be hidden. You have always loved me, Kevin. Every lie he told only confirmed who he really was. Every intercepted message, every diverted payment, every attempt to isolate me was noted, and now it will be exposed. I paused, letting my mother's words sink in. Jessica's eyes widened, Tyler's shoulders slumped. Richard looked like he might faint, his hands shaking as he tried to snatch the letter from me. No, he barked. You can't do this. Yes, I can, I replied calmly. Because you underestimated her. You underestimated me. And now, thanks to her foresight, justice will be served. Mr. Thompson leaned forward, opening a stack of documents. Margaret installed security cameras throughout the house 2 years ago. Richard had no knowledge of them. Every visit, every interaction, every manipulation recorded. Additionally, she hired multiple investigators to research Richard's past, including his first wife, Linda Morrison. Richard paled further, his voice barely audible. That's impossible. I wish it were, I said, my voice calm, almost serene. But Linda Morrison died under circumstances eerily similar to what you attempted with Mum. Your first wife changed her will, signed a medical power of attorney giving you control, and then died. You were careful, yes, but Mum saw the pattern, Kevin, and documented it meticulously. The same manipulations, the same attempts to isolate, the same pressures to control finances. She left a complete timeline. Tyler whispered, his voice cracking. Dad, you really tried to kill Mum. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came. He looked at his children with empty eyes, realizing for the first time the scale of exposure. The inevitability of consequences. I continued reading from my mother's letter. Kevin, the time has come to ensure that no more harm can come from him. All evidence has been gathered. Everything is documented. You have the power to act, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity and protection. He will face civil and criminal consequences. Your stepfather thought he could outsmart us. He was wrong. Richard collapsed back into his chair, defeated. His empire of lies had crumbled. Jessica and Tyler sat frozen, guilt and fear etching lines across their young faces. Mr. Thompson closed the folder. Kevin, we now have sufficient evidence to reopen investigations into both attempted harm to Margaret and suspicious circumstances surrounding Linda Morrison's death. The case is irrefutable, supported by medical records, recordings, witness statements, and documented patterns of behavior. I felt a strange mixture of triumph and relief. Relief that my mother's foresight had protected not only her legacy, but the safety of anyone else Richard might target in the future. Triumph, yes, because finally, after years of witnessing his manipulation, greed, and cruelty, I could see the truth laid bare. Richard's voice was now a broken whisper. Kevin, you don't understand. She was sick. She was confused. Shook my head, calm, resolute. No, Richard. She was brilliant. She planned this all. And now, justice will prevail. Jessica sobbed quietly, tears streaming down her face. Tyler buried his face in his hands, trembling, and Richard sat silent, white-faced, stripped of every illusion of control. Mr. Thompson closed his briefcase. The next steps are legal proceedings, Kevin, but everything your mother left behind ensures that accountability will be enforced. I stood, gathering the documents, feeling a sense of closure I had never imagined possible. Thank you, James, for everything. As we left the office, the sun had dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets. I looked back once, at Richard, Jessica, and Tyler, the once powerful family, now exposed, fragile. Human. And for the first time in years, I felt peace. The courthouse loomed like a monolith of justice, intimidating yet oddly reassuring. I felt the weight of the past 2 years pressing against my shoulders. But for the first time, it wasn't crushing, it was empowering. My mother's meticulous planning had led to this moment. Every recorded conversation, every document, every note she'd left behind was about to speak louder than any lie Richard Morrison could ever tell. I passed through security, keeping my head high. The media buzzed outside. Cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward as reporters whispered and speculated. Some recognized me from previous interviews. Some were drawn purely by the sensational nature of the Morrison family scandal. None of it mattered. All that mattered was that the truth finally would come out. Inside the courtroom smelled of polished wood and faint coffee. The judge's gavel had not yet struck, but you could feel the anticipation vibrating in the air. Richard sat at the defense table, his posture stiff, his face drained of color. Jessica and Tyler flanked him, trying to mask their guilt, but it was transparent, written on their faces in lines of fear and regret. The prosecutor, Kevin Jameson, a sharp, determined man, gave me a brief nod as he set up his materials. I returned it with a calm, measured breath. I had spent months preparing, coordinating with him, going over every piece of evidence my mother had left. Every detail mattered. The trial began with the reading of charges. Richard Morrison was facing multiple counts: attempted premeditated murder of Margaret Morrison, financial fraud, psychological abuse, and complicity in the suspicious death of his first wife, Linda Morrison. Jessica and Tyler faced charges for complicity, financial misconduct, and obstruction. The opening statements were methodical. Kevin painted a vivid picture of Richard's pattern of manipulation, isolation, and exploitation. He spoke of my mother's intelligence, foresight, and bravery, highlighting how she had meticulously documented every interaction, creating a perfect trail of evidence. Richard's defense tried to paint him as a devoted husband, someone who had genuinely cared for Margaret, misinterpreted her medications, and only acted out of concern. But the contrast between the defense's portrayal and the cold, hard evidence was stark. The videos from the security cameras, the investigators' reports, the email chains, and the medical documentation all pointed to a deliberate pattern of abuse, coercion, and control. Day after day, the courtroom became a theater of truth. Recordings played, showing Richard instructing Jessica on how to keep me occupied during critical medical appointments. Photos revealed unauthorized medication changes. Investigators testified to the suspicious behavior and manipulations Richard had carried out, not only with Margaret, but previously with Linda Morrison. The more evidence emerged, the more Richard's composure crumbled. He would start a sentence, then stop, glance at his children, and falter. His lawyer's confident gestures grew smaller, less convincing, as the proof mounted. I sat in the front row, clutching my mother's letter in my hand, the paper worn. From repeated readings, each paragraph was a reminder of her wisdom, courage, and strategy. I could almost hear her voice guiding me, steady and calm, through the storm. On the fourth day of the trial, the prosecution introduced the timeline comparing Linda Morrison's death with the patterns Richard repeated with Margaret. The similarities were uncanny: isolation from family, unauthorized medical decisions, pressure to change wills, and the pursuit of complete financial control. The court listened in stunned silence as forensic evidence revealed traces of medications, in both cases, that Richard had researched meticulously. Tyler squirmed in his chair as the prosecution presented text messages detailing his discussions with friends about the timing of Margaret's final days. Jessica's eyes welled with tears as emails were read aloud, showing her complicity in financial misappropriations. When the recordings played, Richard's voice instructing on the dosage manipulations and how to mislead doctors, the courtroom collectively held its breath. It wasn't just incriminating, it was damning. Even his defense attorneys began whispering amongst themselves. Realizing the impossibility of countering the evidence, by the fifth week, the trial had taken an emotional toll on everyone in that room. I watched as Jessica finally broke down, openly weeping, while Tyler buried his face in his hands. The jury was attentive, scribbling notes as each witness recounted Richard's pattern of abuse and greed. On the sixth week, the closing arguments were delivered. Kevin Jameson's voice resonated with authority and clarity. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not merely about one man's greed or ambition. It is about a systematic, calculated pattern of predation. Margaret Morrison, a courageous, brilliant woman, documented everything to ensure that truth would prevail. Richard Morrison believed he could manipulate, deceive, and harm with impunity. Today, the evidence proves he could not. Justice is not only deserved, it is inevitable. The defense tried one final appeal to emotion, portraying Richard as misunderstood, a man who truly loved Margaret. But the jury had seen and heard the truth. Every document, every recording, every witness account painted a picture impossible to deny. When the jury filed back into the courtroom after deliberation, their faces were somber but resolute. The forepersons stood and read the verdict. On the charges of attempted premeditated murder of Margaret Morrison, we find the defendant guilty. On the charges related to Linda Morrison, we find the defendant guilty. On the charges of financial fraud and psychological abuse, guilty on all counts against Jessica and Tyler Morrison, guilty as charged. The courtroom erupted, some in shock, some in silent relief. Richard's face was a mask of disbelief, his world collapsing around him. His children sat silently, the reality of their actions sinking in. The sentencing was severe, but just Richard received 25 years to life for the attempted murder of Margaret plus 15 consecutive years for crimes related to Linda Morrison, no possibility of parole for the first 20 years. Jessica received 2 years with probation, community service, and restitution payments. Tyler faced 3 years in prison with mandatory rehabilitation programs and restitution responsibilities. As I left the courthouse, I felt a strange mixture of sorrow, relief, and triumph. Justice had been served, but it was bittersweet. My mother was gone, and no verdict could truly bring her back. Yet her legacy lived in the foundation I established in her name. In the families protected, in the lives she had safeguarded, by turning her own tragedy into a blueprint for vigilance and courage. Every child, every patient, every vulnerable adult, helped by the Margaret Morrison Foundation, carried a piece of her wisdom forward. I visited her grave that evening, the air thick with the scent of fresh coral roses. "You were right, Mum," I whispered. "Intelligence beats manipulation, patience beats greed, and love, real love, always triumphs over deceit." For the first time in years, I laughed softly, genuinely hearing the echo of her laughter in the wind, in the rustling leaves. Her trap had worked perfectly. Justice had been served, and her legacy was unbroken. After the trial, life felt surreal. The court's verdict had been decisive, the media coverage extensive. But the most important part wasn't the headlines, it was the shift within me. I had spent so many years consumed by anger, by the feeling of helplessness when I couldn't protect my mother. Now, with justice served, I realized my purpose had changed. The grief was still there, raw and jagged, but it had a direction: action, protection, and transformation. With part of the inheritance, I founded the Margaret Morrison Foundation, naming it after the woman who had taught me the ultimate lesson in strategy, courage, and foresight. The mission was simple, yet ambitious: to protect vulnerable patients from financial abuse, medical negligence, and manipulative caregivers. My mother's story had been extreme, but I knew countless families suffered quietly, afraid to speak out, unsure where to turn. The first step was building a team. I recruited social workers, legal experts, and healthcare advocates, people who shared the same vision of proactive protection. Each member of the team had personal experience with vulnerability, which brought empathy, determination, and insight to our work. The office was modest, far smaller than the Morrison Mansion or any of Richard's former properties. But it was buzzing with purpose and energy. We began by identifying families at risk, creating programs for financial oversight and medical advocacy. Our work wasn't glamorous. It was tedious, detailed, and sometimes emotionally exhausting. We pored over medical bills, bank statements, care schedules, and legal documents. We installed alerts for unusual financial activity, created emergency support networks, and offered counseling for families grappling with the complex emotions of caring for a seriously ill loved one. Within the first year, we had intervened in 12 cases where financial abuse was imminent. In each case, families were astonished that someone had noticed patterns they hadn't even recognized. There was relief, yes, but also gratitude that went deeper than words could convey. One family told me they felt like they had a guardian angel watching over them. I didn't correct them. In some ways, my mother had become that guardian angel. Jessica and Tyler, despite their convictions, had started reaching out with genuine letters of apology. At first, I ignored them. There was too much anger, too many questions left unanswered. But over time, the letters became reflective, showing insight, acknowledgement, and a willingness to change. Jessica spoke about her work as a nursing assistant, and how caring for patients had humbled her. Tyler described the difficulty of rebuilding his life, confronting addiction, and taking responsibility for the consequences of his actions. I responded, cautiously but openly. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about excusing past wrongs, it was about allowing people to grow, to learn, and to transform. It was about taking the lessons of suffering and ensuring that they produced something meaningful, rather than festering into bitterness. Meanwhile, the foundation began to grow. Local hospitals partnered with us to create workshops for caregivers, providing training on ethical practices, documentation, and patient rights. Attorneys collaborated with our team to create legal frameworks that allowed families to intervene before abuse escalated. Media coverage highlighted our cases anonymously, drawing attention to systemic gaps in patient protection and showing that vigilance could prevent tragedy. I also made it a point to visit my mother's grave regularly. These visits weren't just about mourning. They were moments of reflection, planning, and gratitude. I would bring coral rosetta flowers she loved and talk to her about our progress. "Mum," I would say, "we've prevented 3 potential cases of elder financial abuse this month alone. Families are safer, and your legacy is alive." On some days, when the wind rustled through the trees, I could almost hear her laugh, that sharp, intelligent laugh that had orchestrated her perfect trap. Even in ordinary life, the lessons she left became my guiding principles. I refused to let fear dictate my choices. I documented everything, not out of paranoia, but as a strategy of protection. I measured patience over impulse, intelligence over anger, and foresight over short-term gain. These habits seeped into every aspect of my life, shaping the way I worked, interacted, and lived. The foundation also gave me the chance to speak publicly, sharing my story in carefully moderated forums to educate others without exposing private details unnecessarily. Each talk became a blend of narrative, guidance, and strategy, helping families understand the subtle tactics predators use and how to counter them proactively. It was therapeutic for me, too. Telling the story transformed grief into purpose, and anger into constructive action. On quieter evenings, when the office emptied and the phones were silent, I would reflect on the journey. From the moment my mother fell ill, to Richard's manipulations, to the trial, and now to the Foundation's work, I could see a path that transformed suffering into empowerment. Pain had become a teacher, and justice had become a tool not only for retribution but for protection and prevention. Sometimes, I would recall Richard's face in court, the arrogance shattered, the bravado stripped away, the man exposed as he truly was. But I didn't relish his downfall for the sake of revenge. I celebrated it because truth and careful planning had prevailed. My mother's intelligence, her patience, and her courage had created a lasting impact that no deception could undo. The legacy extended beyond legal victories. Families we helped began to pay it forward, sharing our message, creating awareness in their communities, and educating others about vigilance, documentation, and assertive advocacy. It was a ripple effect, small at first, but expanding steadily, just as my mother had hoped. And so, life moved forward not in a sudden miraculous healing, but in deliberate, strategic steps. Each day brought challenges, new cases, difficult families, bureaucratic roadblocks, but each day also brought proof that the principles my mother lived by could protect and empower. Long after her death, one afternoon, I received a call from a family whose grandmother had been targeted by a financial predator disguised as a caregiver. They were terrified, exhausted, and unsure what to do. As I walked them through the steps, documentation, legal counsel, and medical oversight, realized that this was exactly what my mother had envisioned. Each intervention was a tribute to her foresight and courage. Through it all, I kept a small photograph of my mother on my desk, a smiling, confident woman who had beaten cancer, outsmarted a predator, and created a blueprint for justice and protection. It was a daily reminder that intelligence, courage, and patience could turn even the darkest moments into something meaningful. Eventually, the foundation grew into a recognized authority, with programs adopted by hospitals and community organizations nationwide. We weren't just preventing abuse, we were educating a generation of families on vigilance, responsibility, and proactive protection. The impact was tangible, measured not only in money saved or interventions made, but in lives preserved, hope restored, and fear replaced with empowerment. And yet, despite all the work, the media attention, and the growing influence of the foundation, I never lost the quiet moments of reflection at my mother's grave. I would kneel, place coral roses, and speak softly. You were right, Mum. Intelligence beats manipulation, patience beats greed, and true love triumphs over deceit. Every life we protect, every family we help, it's your victory, too. It was in those moments that I understood the full depth of her lessons. Revenge had never been the point. Protection, foresight, and transformation had been her true legacy. She had shown me that even in the face of deceit, betrayal, and loss, a strategic mind and a courageous heart could create lasting impact. And as I looked across the cemetery, feeling the wind carry the scent of the coral roses, I knew that Margaret Morrison's spirit lived on, not just in me, but in every life we touched, every predator we stopped, and every family we empowered. Justice had been served, yes, but her greatest triumph was the enduring legacy of vigilance, courage, and hope.